There's an old question that no one has really answered. Why did Russia actually sell Alaska? This event took place in 1867. Alaska is a vast territory, over 1.5 million square kilometers, with equally vast reserves of natural resources, many of which haven't even been explored yet. There was probably a strong but hidden reason why Russia ceded Alaska for a modest $7 million, which were never actually paid. At that time, Russia's main income from this territory came from the fur trade. For some reason, it was decided that maintaining and defending this remote territory became more costly than its potential profits. There were no military conflicts or claims from the United States, so why was it sold? Whose initiative was it? As we now know, in the 19th century, some kind of global catastrophe occurred, and perhaps all of this was connected to climate change and the closing of the Northern Sea by ice. This route enabled communication with Alaska and Russian America, and not through the southern latitudes when ships from St. Petersburg supposedly had to go around South America to reach our ports and forts in that region. Even for modern ships, rounding South America is a great danger. There are almost constant storms near Cape Horn, which is called the Marine Everest. This place has constant strong winds, making the ocean dangerous. Fogs are frequent and the sun rarely appears. The Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't built yet, otherwise the cargo could have been unloaded at Vladivostok and sent overland to European Russia. In general, contact between Russian America and St. Petersburg would have been logical if ships had sailed through the Arctic Ocean. There's also debate over whether Russia controlled Siberia before the early 19th century. Now, researchers have a lot of information that this territory, including Western America, at that time was Tartary, which was not subordinate to Moscow or St. Petersburg. Interesting fact, the Russian colonists' capital in Alaska was called Arkhangelsk. Again, no one raises the question of why the European countries were developing the east coast of North America, while the Russians aimed for the west coast. And this was without the Panama Canal. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was founded much earlier than Vladivostok, even though it is much farther north. All this suggests that the Northern Sea route used to be navigable. It makes sense that the Pomors from Arkhangelsk could reach Alaska on cabotage voyages and then continue down the North American coast to California. Historical reference. According to legends collected by historians and geographers, it is known that the inhabitants of the Arkhangelsk province had their own trade relations by sea in the 16th and 17th centuries with the inhabitants of northern Asia along the Ob and Yenisei rivers. Later, over time, the voyages of the Pomors stopped completely due to obstructing ice in the Kara Sea and other natural difficulties. That is, there was a cooling, and the Northern Sea route froze over. America became unreachable, so Alaska was sold because it couldn't be maintained, not due to a lack of fur, as the official story says. It turns out that it was at that time that Count Nikolai Ryazanov didn't sail to his Conchita from Juneau and Avos. For those who don't know, this count goes on an expedition to California to establish trade relations with the Spanish. There he met a young Spanish aristocrat, Conchita, the daughter of the commandant of San Francisco. A passionate love ignites between them. Ryazanov returns to Russia for marriage approval but dies en route, apparently freezing in the ice. After waiting 30 years for Ryazanov, Conchita becomes a nun in a Dominican monastery cell. A sugar factory operated in Arkhangelsk for a long time, supplying sugar to all of Russia, including the imperial court. This historical fact is not widely publicized by historians. Nowadays, even in Arkhangelsk, few people know about it. The official account says Brandt shipped sugarcane from Brazil around the world. Common sense tells us that such a version doesn't fit into any economic framework. But if we assume that the sugarcane was transported by ships from California via the Northern Sea route, then everything becomes logical. Arkhangelsk is the first port on the coast of the Arctic Ocean that has a connected lake and river system with European Russia, including St. Petersburg. According to the official version, in the 1830s the factory suddenly declined, and so the local authorities didn't know what to do with the vacated property. As a result, a vocational school was opened in its buildings. Here is another indication of the global events of the 1830s. Wilhelm Brandt is an interesting figure, a magnate, merchant, and industrialist. If you look at his activities with an open mind, it turns out that he was the one who built the entire Arkhangelsk that existed at that time. He also owned it. At the same time, as an entrepreneur, he was both the governor and simultaneously the ambassador consul of all the major European countries. He is buried in Arkhangelsk. But historians also don't like to talk about this, and as a result, Wilhelm Brandt was forgotten, just like the sugar factory. Among historians, there is an opinion that the heyday of Arkhangelsk was before the time of Peter the Great, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the city had become a rundown province. As evidence, they cite the statistics of ships entering the port each year. They link this to the Romanovs forcibly restricting traffic to Arkhangelsk while building St. Petersburg. However, if we accept the version about the freezing of the Northern Sea route, then the sharp decline in traffic seems completely natural. If we ignore the official story that Ivan the Terrible ordered a city built around the Arkhangelsk monastery, it actually just meant building a palisade of sharpened logs at the time. About Pyotr I, who was in Arkhangelsk and started building shipyards and ships. This story repeats that of Boris Godunov, who did the same thing but exactly 100 years earlier. In fact, the English, led by Richard Chancellor, opened their own branch on the White Sea coast. They then tried to contact Muscovian more. This version is supported by the fact that there are many English toponyms in Arkhangelsk, the English church, house, and street. There were as many churches in Arkhangelsk as there were Orthodox churches. Now there are gyms, government offices, etc. Arkhangelsk is called Saint Michael the Archangel on old European maps, that is, in the Catholic manner, Saint Archangel. Here's an interesting fact. When wars happen on Russian territory, World War I, the Crimean War, or the Time of Troubles, the English come to Arkhangelsk, take it under their wing, and the city is always peaceful. And when the situation is resolved, the English quietly leave. What else is interesting about this topic? Wilhelm Brandt was actually the fourth wealthiest person in Russia at that time. A brief summary about his sugar business. During the Continental blockade, starting from 1809 American ships began arriving in Arkhangelsk for the first time, delivering up to 120,000 puds of granulated sugar. At the request of the authorities, Arkhangelsk merchants Afanasy Amosov, Vasily Popov, and Wilhelm Brandt built 6 sugar factories in a short period of time, spending up to 1,000,000 rubles on these projects. The merchants began producing about 120,000 puds of sugar, which was sold in the Arkhangelsk province, but mainly in neighboring cities and at the Makaryev and Irbit fairs. By 1832, under the supervision of shipbuilder Vasily Khabarov, 23 large merchant ships had been built, all of which had excellent seaworthiness. In the photo, we see the modern view of Brandt's sugar factory in Arkhangelsk. With Brandt's funds, a research expedition was organized under the leadership of Lieutenant Paktusov and Lieutenant Krotov, with the goal of studying the coastline of Novaya Zemlya and charting a sea route to the Yenisei. This happened after the sugar factories had already been opened. Sadly, this expedition turned out to be fatal for almost everyone who took part in it. Krotov, along with his schooner Yenisei, perished off the coast of Novaya Zemlya. Paktusov died soon after returning from his second expedition, and Brandt himself unexpectedly passed away the day after the expedition was sent off. Historical note: Wilhelm Brandt passed away suddenly on August 5, 1832 at the age of 54. While participating together in the preparation of the expedition he sponsored to search for a safe route to the Yenisei, to explore the eastern coast of Novaya Zemlya, and to establish trading posts on the shores and islands of the Kara Sea. The question is, why would such a merchant be involved in geographical research of the Arctic? He was likely searching for a route to Alaska through the Northern Sea route, which he had previously used to transport goods from North America. He made an attempt to organize expeditions to establish summer navigation to North America so that his factory could continue operating on North American raw materials. The Russian Empire was meant to keep a short route to Alaska. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Northern Sea route could exist for ships that were not of the icebreaker class of that time at all. Expeditions along the coast of northern Eurasia prove this. Here is the route of Laptov's expedition, mid-18th century. In the early 19th century there was an expedition led by Ferdinand Wrangel and Fyodor Matyushkin. They surveyed the coast of the Arctic Ocean from the mouth of the Kolyma River to Kluchinskaya Bay in Chukotka. What was Arkhangelsk like? It was the capital of Russian America, founded in 1799. After the sale of Russian possessions to the United States in 1867, the city was renamed Sitka. In 1822, a new house with an iron roof was built for the governor in the Zamkovy Hill fortress, delivered from St. Petersburg. By the time of the sale, the city was called the Paris of the Pacific. It was considered European in its development, built in the style of St. Petersburg, with which it was on the same latitude. And indeed, it would have been more logical to name the city Novopeterburg in 1867. Russian Ambassador Edward Stekel and American Secretary of State William Seward signed the document for the sale of Alaska to the United States. The treaty came into force after the procedure of exchanging ratification documents was completed in the American capital, Washington. The Russian tricolor was lowered and Alaska officially became part of the United States. Perhaps Arkhangelsk is just an intermediate port for trade shipments from North America. In California, there was Fort Ross, a Russian settlement that existed until 1841. Fort Ross was sold to a major American landowner, John Sutter, before Alaska was sold. Logically, this was very strange, since there were 26 years left before the sale of Alaska. So, by 1841, the connection through the Northern Sea had ceased, which means there was a cooling period. Sugarcane is the main crop in the Hawaiian Islands and in California, and in Hawaii, Russia had its own colony. This is evidenced by the Elizabeth Fortress on the island of Kauai. So let's return once again to the possible reason for the laws of navigation along the Northern Sea route. Climatologists have information that in 1831 there was a significant drop in atmospheric temperature in the northern hemisphere, which caused serious changes in the climate. The culprit was the Zavritsky volcano in the Kuril Islands. Looking at a photograph of this volcano, two associations come to mind. It looks very much like a giant quarry, of which there are many all over the world. And this formation could also be the result of a nuclear explosion of enormous power. And of course, it could have been a volcano that formed due to tectonic shifts as a result of a global catastrophe of that time. Overall, this whole story with the sale of Alaska, the sudden cooling, and the closure of the Northern Sea route fits very well with the flood of the early 19th century. The so-called Tartaria stretched from the Ural Mountains to North America, and the destruction of this territory was connected to a global cataclysm. The subsequent purge in Siberia and Western America was aimed at eliminating the remnants of the Mughal Tartarian Empire, or historically, the Mongol Tatar yoke. Probably, after the cataclysm near Delitzsch, Alaska was initially assigned to Russia, but then the territorial arrangement was changed in order to more clearly separate the West from the East to create future confrontations that we are witnessing now. That's why history records it as Alaska's sale to the United States. Well, we know very well how official historical events that never actually happened are created. There's a little known fact that Russia once owned one of the Hawaiian Islands. In the early 1800s, a Russian fortress stood on Kauai, and the construction was part of Georg Scheffer's plan to establish a colony on the island and eventually annex Hawaii to the Russian Empire. Baron Yegor Nikolaevich Scheffer, also known as Georg Anton Alois von Scheffer, was a German-Russian scientist, naturalist, mineralogist, biologist, pharmacist, and traveler who served as a colonist for the Russian Empire. The Hawaiian Islands were discovered by James Cook's third expedition in 1778 and in 1804 during the first Russian circumnavigation led by Nikolai Ryazanov. Russians visited Hawaii for the first time on the Nadezhda and Neva ships. Relations were established with the local tribes and the kings Kamehameha and Kaumuali, and the latter agreed to become a subject of Russia if the mother country agreed to protect him from the hostile actions of Kamehameha. especially after Scheffer cured the chief's wife. In 1815, Scheffer and his people were granted several Hawaiian villages and a number of territories. He was allowed to cut down sandalwood trees for trading this timber. Scheffer, with several hundred local workers he had hired, established gardens, built a number of buildings, and 3 fortresses. Of these, only the remains of the stone walls of the Elizabeth Fortress, located near the mouth of the Waimea River, have survived to this day. Interestingly, the Elizabeth Fortress was built as a star-shaped fortress. But the Russians' presence on the island was short-lived. The Americans built their trading post on Komuali's lands and began to push the Russians out, buying up all the goods promised by our king. And in June 1817 there was even an armed clash between the Russians and the Americans. 5 American warships sailed to the island and completely destroyed all the Russian trading posts and plantations. And the Russian subjects were put on one of our ships and forced to leave. Why did the Americans act so brazenly, and why hadn't they cared about Hawaii before? The theory is that when the Anglo-American War, which lasted from 1812 to 1815, ended, this, as we remember, was officially a conflict between the United States and Great Britain, which the Americans called the Second War of Independence. And the United States had free military units, which made it possible for them to continue their colonial expansion. 2 warring kingdoms. The Americans immediately saw their chance to use others to wipe out the local population and eventually take over this paradise for themselves. Scheffer was not initially provided with a warship to protect the colony. In 1818, Scheffer arrived in Russia and called for the capture of all the Hawaiian Islands, arguing the expected benefits of returning the colony. He was supported by the Russian-American company, but the Tsar rejected the project. Here we see the remains of the Elizavetinskaya fortress. The government did not want to worsen relations with the United States before the start of negotiations on Russia's inclusion in the Holy Alliance and responded with a refusal. There were doubts expressed about the profitability of trade with Hawaii. And in 1821, Russia effectively recognized the islands as a sphere of American influence and shifted its focus to developing the colony in California. A little later, Scheffer moved to Brazil along with 4 families of his compatriots. That's 47 people. He founded the first German colony in Brazil, Frankenthal, on the land granted to him in the state of Bahia. There, he spent the rest of his days in obscurity. In the 1820s, Russian consul Pyotr Dabel visited Hawaii. He saw that the Hawaiian kingdom was torn apart by internal strife. The local king, Kamehameha II, asked him to request help and protection from Alexander the Sien to maintain his power and throne. The Russian government did not respond to this request. The locals used our fortress, renamed Fort Hippo, until 1864. In 1966, the ruins of the fortress were declared a National Historic Landmark of the United States. Now the Russian Fort Elizabeth Historical Park is located here. So, if Alexander III had shown more will and character, there would have been a more significant Russian presence in Hawaii. Of course, most likely this colony, like Alaska, would have been sold as well. It's just too far away. Many people wonder why the Anglo-Saxons and other European countries managed to keep colonies in various parts of the world, while Russia never succeeded. There was an interesting fact. After the Americans captured Iraq, Russia was offered to jointly expropriate the oil fields, but with a small discount. However, Russia refused, even though it could have gained a lot from it. The thing is, European countries have always pursued a colonial policy. This is direct seizure or the use of internal contradictions within the colonized territory to advance their own political and economic influence. And here, the disunity and contradictions among the population of the small Hawaiian Islands came just in time for the United States policy. Russia, on the other hand, was never strong in intrigue and colonial policy, which is why it never really liked being in Hawaii. There was a place for us.